Michael Woodhouse.
Mr Speaker, I can assure the member who's just resumed his seat that we were listening, albeit that having a significant hearing loss of my own, it was difficult at times. It's a hearing loss that was congenital and probably not helped by the fact that I blew a rugby whistle for about the last 11 years, shot a rifle for the last 30. But if an audiologist had said to me that even one skerrick of that hearing loss was work-related, then that would be accepted for cover, and I don't think that's appropriate. So I support those changes. I'll talk more about them in the committee stage of the bill, but it does actually reinforce the polarised views that a committee that's otherwise in a pretty good cooperative state had through the submissions. And that rhetoric lacked quite a bit of substance, frankly. We had claims about breaches of ILO conventions that New Zealand hasn't even signed up to, and claims that the changes proposed were in breach of the underpinning principles of the scheme, even when some of those changes were due to realign scheme entitlements with the Royal Commission report. Self-inflicted injury is one such example. I want to come back to the Woodhouse report in a moment, but one of the games the submitters and even the committee members played was the one of my statistic is bigger than your statistic. And a really good example of that was around motorcycle accident rates. And they came up during protests about motorcycle levies, not necessarily directly related to this bill, but those protests became sort of the vanguard of disaffection at proposed changes in ACC. But it's a bit ironic, really, because the protest was about the levy increases at the same time as they also rallied against the perceived cuts to the entitlements that this bill might give effect to. But the worst of the stat versus stat exchanges were around ACC's annual reports, and they continue in the House today. The opposition have attacked not only the veracity of the data that their ministers put their signatures to, but also the people who prepared them. They attack the employees of ACC, the actuaries, the Auditor General's staff, and that's a shame on that opposition. Even now, the opposition deny there's a financial problem. We've heard of climate change deniers, Mr Speaker, and now we have a large group in this House that are finance change deniers, including the former minister who put her signature to a $2.4 billion deficit and now denies it's a problem. She spoke in her call describing insolvency as when liabilities exceed assets, but what she didn't say was why that wasn't a problem to her. Because she thinks that all a government has to do is reach its hand into the pockets of hard-working levy payers, even at a time when economic conditions don't warrant it. And when the reality of the sorts of nonsense that went on over the last 9 years started to bite, and the last financial report presented the House with a $4.8 billion deficit, they still deny the problem. Finance change deniers, Mr Speaker. Now, I don't intend to cover off any of the specific changes in this reading. I'll leave that for the committee stage of the bill. But I do want to touch on some of those underpinning principles and suggestions by some that the changes in this bill is against the principles of the Royal Commission report. Now, I wonder if many who've referred to the Woodhouse report have actually read it. And I suggest they do, because it's a very illuminating insight into a different time and a different place. The Woodhouse report contains the 5 cornerstone principles that Rahui Katini listed, principles that I and my party very strongly support. But it also gives some pretty revealing insights into a society at that time and the reasons why the workers' compensation was framed in the way that it was. I'll give you an example. Clause 413, it talks about cover for women, something that Ms Beaumont is very strongly in favour of course, and I quote, "And we have attempted to resolve the administrative problem associated with minor mishaps to housewives by recommending that for 14 days their families might well take the strain themselves." End quote. Now, the report was replete with references in the masculine form, not only because that was the way reports were written in those days, but simply it did not contemplate that women would participate in the workforce to the degree that they do now, much less get injured. It was written about cover for external force injuries to men who worked on building sites, railway lines, forests and so on. 42 years later, life has changed considerably, Mr. Speaker, and the Royal Commission report, in my view, is simply not able to cover all the new issues that the scheme faces: treatment injuries, sexual abuse, occupation overuse syndrome. Whole industries like the IT industry weren't even around in 1967. So the principles that report established are strong and enduring. But we should be careful not to deify the report. We should not treat it like some sacred cow, the details of which will endure for all time. It simply isn't capable of being that. And even from the financial perspective, the whole scope of the scheme, as anticipated by the Royal Commission report, has changed so much that now it's unrecognisable. The appendix to that report contains an estimate of scheme costs. Now, if you compare those costs even on a cash basis only, forget the arguments about full funding, what it reveals about the way in which the scheme has grown beyond any sort of comprehension that the report authors contemplated is quite compelling. If you take the figures in Appendix 9 and plot them against population growth and inflation, while there has been an 8-fold increase in average salaries in New Zealand, there has been a 51-fold increase in the cash costs per person to manage the scheme. And most of that growth has occurred in the last 5 years. So by any measure, that growth requires a response, and this bill is a very good start along that path. I support the intentions of the bill. I look forward to debating the merits of those individual clauses in the committee stage, and I commend it to the House.